Hello everyone, my name is Phawx. In this video I'm going to be reviewing MSI's handheld, the MSI Claw. This is using Intel's latest Meteor Lake chip, the 155H. There's also a lower tier model, the 135H. And I don't think I could recommend either one of them. I'm specifically reviewing their higher end model, the 155H with the 1TB SSD. For the cost, it's completely not recommendable at all, and I'll explain why in this particular video as we go along. Up first, let's go ahead and jump into what it looks like going into the BIOS and opening up the advanced BIOS menu. I'm actually going to show you how you can disable the E-cores. You can do a bunch of other stuff. Later on in this video, I see if disabling the E-cores does anything for performance, so you can go and check that later on in the video as well. For all the benchmarks that I'm doing, all of it is the default settings, but I do test benchmarks across 10 watt, 15 watt, 20 watt, and 25 watt TDP slices, and I'll compare it to AMD's 8840U. I am mindful of comparing them against total system power so that they are basically apples to apples, so you have a better comparison. We're going to show you what that's like and what that actually means throughout this entire video, but let's look into the BIOS and talk about the specs. Quickly looking at the BIOS and the specs for the MSI Claw, you can see right there through the marketing name right there, it says Claw A1M. If we go to storage information, you can see that the model I bought was indeed the 1TB model. They use Kyojia as their brand for the 1TB. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. For specs, we can quickly kind of summarize everything down to a few different core points. We have the Intel Core Ultra 7 155H is the model that I have. We also have 16 gigabytes of LPDDR5 RAM. And more importantly, we can take a look that they are including their big bad boy Wi-Fi chip, which is their killer Wi-Fi 7 BE1750X wireless network adapter. That's Intel's biggest line, I guess, and part of their Wi-Fi 7. For what it's worth, even their Wi-Fi 6 stuff, their AX210 line, is fantastic, and I don't think that this was generally needed, but it's still nice that on the Claw they do have the big bad boy Wi-Fi in there. So that's pretty nice to see. If we go to advanced, these are the types of options that we can enable and disable before we enable the more advanced options using a hidden key combo, which I'll show you just in a second. If we go down here, MAC address pass-through, this is what we have. If we do USB configuration, that's what we have there. UEFI BIOS, we can do a BIOS update through the BIOS itself, and then Intel Rapid Storage Technology, if it were possible to do any type of RAID through Intel's Rapid Storage Technology, IRST. And then we can do the boot options, security, and save and exit. Now, Cypher made me aware of this, and I actually looked it up on other places as well, just so I can get an idea of it. So thank you very much to Cypher for letting me know that there is indeed a hidden key combo. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit right control, right shift, left alt, and F2. And when we hit all of those keys, boom, we have the super advanced BIOS menu, and we can take a look at some more information that is available to us in the BIOS. So we can see the Intel Core Ultra 7 155H. We have 8 E-cores, 6 P-cores, and 2 low-power E-cores. These are on another die all by themselves. And those are even more low power. I always wondered if we could disable E-cores and P-cores and just run on the 2 low-power E-cores. So effectively just shutting off whole stages of the chip as those 2 low-power E-cores are on another island on Intel's 155H. So we'll go there and we'll take a look at advanced, and we can see we have a bunch more options available to us. So we're going to go see if I can disable all of the E-cores, because later on in this video, we're going to see what it looks like when we disable E-cores and if Doom Eternal performance improves at all and how much it improves, if it does at all. User scenario can see performance and balance mode. By default, it is in balance mode. Wi-Fi band selection. So if you're hardcore into Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, that is definitely going to be a thing for you. CPU configuration. This is what we're looking for. Efficient core. Performance core, okay, that's what we have there. CPU flex ratio override. We have Intel, that's fine. AVX we want enabled. All active performance cores, all. We do want that, we can disable that. Look at this, we can actually do, interesting, we can do the SoC North efficient cores. Very interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and disable all of my E-cores. I'm going to set that to 0. I'm also going to leave those super low power efficient cores enabled. I do want to see what it looks like when we just have those running, if it can run at all. So that'll be interesting to see. But I'll do that last, because if that's going to brick my device, I'd rather do that as a last resort. It might go into another type of video altogether. Power and performance, CPU power management, boot max frequency, turbo performance, what do we have here? Max battery, Intel race to halt, that's fine. Per core P state OS control, that's fine. Turbo mode, view configure turbo options, turbo ratio limit. Okay, energy efficient P state enabled. We definitely want efficient P state enabled, package power limit, MSR, config, TDP. So this is the default TDP that it goes to, but set a bit high by default. What is this? Acoustic. The fan is very, very low as well. PL4, CPU C states, custom P state table, number of P states, 0. What else we have? CPU lock, power limit 3 override. Okay, power management control. This is for the clock frequency on the GPU, and we can just set that to max. Some of these settings, it should be noted that even though they're available to you, doesn't necessarily mean that they will enable even if you push them to. So be aware that just setting things doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to take effect. Overclocking, these are things that we don't really care about. Like overclocking on memory is something that's worthwhile if we can, change that up. But overclocking on the CPU and GPU, on the GPU might be worthwhile, but on the CPU we can already clock too high. We can't literally power it. If we powered just the P cores, we'd be using more than 40 watts by itself. So there is no sense in overclocking. Thinking about overclocking, don't even consider it, because we can't even cool it off properly. Okay. All right. I think that's it. I think what I care about is the CPU configuration and making efficient cores off. So I'm going to go ahead, save changes, and reset. Okay, so we just booted up and I went into it real quick. You can indeed see 8 cores down there. So we have the 6 P cores that are active. None of the E cores are active. And we have the 2 low power E cores that are on another island altogether and part of like that Northbridge part of the chip. So let's go ahead and see later on in this video if that actually changes anything. But let's get into the next part of this video. A quick word of caution here. Don't use that advanced BIOS hotkey menu and start changing settings willy-nilly. Some of those settings may potentially soft break your device. At worst case, super brick your device. Even resetting the BIOS may not bring it back up. So be careful when you're noodling around in there, and only do things that you know what you're doing. Obviously, disabling E-cores is something that a lot of things have happened, and it works just fine. And I showed you in the video, works just fine. So you can do that if you want for different types of performance tests that you want to do on the device. You can go through that avenue. With that out of the way, I do want to kind of talk about that MSI's software right now is a bit half-baked. We'll discuss that a little bit more in my build quality review, part of this review video, but there are bugs that are present, like the LEDs just flashing until you actually go into MSI Center to set that. That's really an MSI problem. When it comes to Intel problems, there are going to be cases where there are going to be games that just don't run, or if it's a brand new game on day one, perhaps it won't run at all, or other things might be broken. There may be visual artifacts and you'll have to wait for a driver update to fix any particular issues. In my particular case, one game that I've often had a problem with, even going back to Tiger Lake days, is Batman Arkham Knight. I have this in my benchmark suite because it is a pretty robust Unreal Engine 3 game that I like to run, because it's also a good test to show, especially across other devices. And the game doesn't run at all. So we're going to go through showing you what that looks like right now. There are just some games that won't run on Intel graphics by default. So you see, I'll go ahead and press play here, and Batman Arkham Knight will load up its splash screen. It'll look like it's loading in the background. There will be no error given to me whatsoever. It'll just kind of go away, and the game will stop running, and Steam will just say that to play again. So I have no indication at all that anything has happened here. It's just, there it goes. It didn't work at all. So then you're going to have to go, as a user, go to PC Gaming Wiki and put in Batman Arkham Knight, and you're going to have to figure out what in the world just happened. So you're going to go to PC Gaming Wiki, you're going to say, oh, Batman Arkham Knight Intel GPU detection fix. Okay, that seems like what we might have a problem with. So I've already gone ahead and downloaded it. We're going to go ahead and copy the files that were extracted from there. We're going to go ahead and copy this. And then I'm going to browse to the directory that Batman Arkham Knight is in, and I'm going to go ahead and overwrite any files that are in here. All right, there it goes. And all right, so now we're going to go back here and press play, and let's see what happens. And there we go. It's loaded. So you can fix games. There's going to be games that you're going to fix, but also who's going to do this? But also no one's going to do this. So this is a problem that Intel finds itself in, is that there are fixes to get games running, but most people are going to have zero idea on how to actually fix the problem. Where if they just press play, a splash screen comes up, there is no error whatsoever, and then it just goes back to stopping the game, and then all you get is a play button again. that is not helpful to the end user, and only the hardcore PC gamers are going to be able to actually solve this problem. So this is a problem that Intel has. Now, not every game is going to be affected by this, but there are going to be games that you're coming along that are going to have this problem. Then there's also the issue of newer games that no game developer has targeted Intel on. They look at NVIDIA first, and then AMD second, and Intel not at all. So you have instances where games might be completely broken on day one, and then Intel has to come and scramble and get drivers to actually make it work on newer games. This is the problem that Intel finds themselves in, and honestly, it is unfortunate. I can sympathize with Intel, but it is still a problem that they have to face. So the end result is most end users, they're going to have games that just don't run for whatever reason, and they're just going to be frustrated by it. So this is one of the things that is part and parcel with where Intel is right now. Unfortunately, Intel has a lot of work ahead of them, with especially the G architecture, where on Intel Gens, this wasn't a problem. Intel Gens, a lot of things just ran, but when they switched over to G, lots of things got broken, and trying to get things running on Windows can sometimes be convoluted. So this is another thing that is a general negative for MSI Claw, and I can't give you every example of things that are breaking. There is a community wiki, there is a community GitHub where the community is submitting problems with Intel's iGPU type of stuff, and Intel is fixing things. Intel has a long way to go to get this thing rolling. Rolling along with Intel's problems, the next problem that we have with Intel Meteor Lake is its idle power. The idle power is unreasonably high. Even if I disable a bunch of MSI stuff, we're still using around 7.5 watts with the machine doing nothing. That's outrageous, especially when Intel has historically been very, very good with idle system power. When we take a look at Tiger Lake especially, that would run at like 3 watts of total system power, and that wasn't even trying to finesse anything. You could actually get it down lower if you really wanted to, but at a default state, it would use 3 watts of total system power. Meanwhile, if we take a look at how that compares to AMD, take a look at this. All right, so here's the problem with the idle power draw on the MSI Claw, which is using Intel's 155H. I've let this sit here for a while. I've also restarted hardware info after everything calmed down so that we don't have any weird averages here. I've renamed charge rate just so it's a lot easier to follow along with. So you can see it says total system power right there. And you can see that we're pretty much 7.4, 7.3. If we go ahead and take a look at the average, it's 7.3 watts average. That's the machine doing absolutely nothing, and the brightness is at 50%. I've also disabled every nonsense I could on MSI side. So these LEDs are off, all of MSI's other crap that they have for like noise cancellation and stuff, that's off. That took forever to launch. Mystic Light, you can see that I just turned it on by just going to it. In this optimized audio experience, this is off. If we go to noise cancellation, all of this is off. Basically everything that I could turn off, I did turn off to make sure that we get as best of an idle power consumption that we possibly can. And when we have these enabled, let's see what we're at right now. Charge level, obviously it is doing stuff in the background, so you saw it spike to 13 watt, but it looks like we're barely anything. Having these LEDs on means practically nothing. So the problem is that we're still at 7.3 watt. Now you may be saying 7.3 watt, what is that in comparison to anything else? Here's the GPD WinMax 2 with a 10.1 inch screen. Now you could say, oh, the larger screen, that should be more. Typically, when we take a look at mobile displays and the backlight's going to be edge lit, so typically the backlight power draw is going to be similar. But if we go ahead and take a look at total system power, again, I renamed that from charge rate, you can see it's 5.4 watt, and we've been averaging 5.3 watt. And I've been letting this run for a while. So we basically have 2 watts less that we're using from total system power. Now, I want to make it clear, this is the 8840U. This is AMD's 8840U. So this is AMD's latest chipset, and this is competing with Intel's 155H. Now you may be asking, what does it matter if we're only using 2 watts more? Well, it's 2 watts more doing absolutely nothing, but on this MSI Claw, we have a 54 watt hour battery. Thankfully, MSI included a bigger battery in there because we're going to need it, because this thing just wastes power for no reason. Now, on a 54 watt hour battery, when we're using 7.3 watts doing nothing, we're looking at 7.5 hours of battery life. However, if we had AMD's 8840U and using 5.3 watts total, we'd have 10.3 hours of battery life. Almost 3 hours more battery life doing nothing. So that's how big of a problem Intel has here on handheld devices, on battery-powered devices, because at a standstill, from a get-go, we're just burning more power here for no reason. I'm basically doing all of this to give a frame of mind for you so that you can understand why the MSI Claw is completely not recommendable compared to every other handheld that's available out there. And one good way to do that is to compare how total system power works between these devices. So I also have another video that I can show you for that as well.
It's really difficult to benchmark handhelds and actually give that in a meaningful way. So what I want to show you here is that you can see that I have the TDP set to 12 watt. However, our total system power is 17.5 watt, 17.7, 17.2, 17.5. Effectively, we're averaging 17.5 watt. And if we take a look at our average FPS, it's 23.4, your minimum and maximum FPS there. And all of these settings are the same. These are all 720p maximum settings. So we're really going to be stressing the GPU here. In the background, what this is resting on is the GPU Max 2 using AMD's latest 8840U. And you can see I have that set to 9 watt TDP, so 3 watts less. However, our total system power, 17.6, 18, we're effectively averaging around 17.5 watts of total system power. If we take a look at our FPS, we're at 28.1. So a considerable margin ahead of Intel's Meteor Lake here at a lower TDP. So I still have a lot of tests that I have to do to give a better understanding of what's going on here. But AMD's last generation GPU is still a bit better than Intel's latest GPU. And if we take a look at Intel's previous GPU, this is effectively in the same line. So this is the 1165 G7. This is their Tiger Lake part. And you can see I had it set to 10 watt TDP, but it'll auto fluctuate TDP down to whatever it needs. So you can see our total system power is 14.5 watts, and you can see our average FPS is 17.1. So really, Intel's Tiger Lake isn't so far behind, especially because we're using a good 2 watts less, 2.5 watts less than what Intel's Meteor Lake is using here. So this is why it's difficult to benchmark and review handhelds, because you have to account for a whole bunch of things.
So now that you have a better understanding of how total system power relates to these other devices, one of the nice things that I can actually say about Meteor Lake is whatever you set the TDP to, it's going to be pretty close to in relation to its total system power. And this is a stark difference to where AMD has been, especially with the SteamDeck coming into the scene. When the SteamDeck LCD first came out, when you set TDP to 15 watt, it would balloon up to 27 watts total. That's 12 watts more just for total system power. And when you look at it through that lens, we're using almost the same amount that we're using for the TDP. Whereas if we set the MSI Claw to 25 watt TDP, we're using around 32 watts total. That's actually pretty impressive, but it means that when we frame these other devices in comparison, we have to notch it down a bunch by about 5 watts. So if I do AMD at 20 watt, I have to compare it to Intel's 155H at 25 watt. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to be doing that in the benchmarks. But before we do that, I want to talk about battery life. The battery life that you can expect out of this device. Now, talking about battery life, when we think about battery life, 10 watt TDP is really the minimum that we're going to be running at. Again, idle power, we're going to be using 7.5 watts for the machine to do nothing. So setting it to 10 watt, we're really not giving the system enough to actually work with. So we're talking about really low end games. At that, you look at around 4 hours of battery life. At 10 watt TDP, you're looking around using around 13 watt total system power. At 25 watt TDP, which is the default TDP the MSI Claw runs at, you're going to be looking at an hour and a half of battery life using the 55 watt hour battery that is on the MSI Claw. And at 25 watt TDP, we're really going to be averaging around 33 watts of total system power. And that's what you're going to see on this graph, where at 25 watt, we're looking at 1.5 hours versus at 10 watt TDP, you're looking at 4 hours. And that's pretty much the range that we're looking at. Best case scenario is 4 hours of battery life and very little will run. So think indie games or really low-end emulation, or at the high end, which is 25 watt TDP, and we're getting the best performance we possibly can, and you're going to be looking at an hour and a half of battery life with that 55 watt hour battery. Moving right along, I want to show you an initial graph. We're going to take a look at a Heaven benchmark, and I've structured this to be GPU bound. We're going to be really stressing the GPU portion of the APU, and we'll be looking at it through the average FPS that we get per TDP. And I'm bringing in the GPU Win 3 here, which is using Intel's Tiger Lake or the 1165 G7. And if we take a look at the blue line, you can see that Intel's Tiger Lake actually outperforms Meteor Lake up to about 12 watt. So 12 watt and below, Tiger Lake is doing sensationally better. Again, remember the idle total system power that we showed you on Tiger Lake. That was around 3 watt average when the machine doing nothing. And on Meteor Lake, we are using 7.5 watts average with the machine doing nothing. So we have this ballooning power of the machine just basically doing nothing. And Tiger Lake is actually able to do better at lower TDPs. Obviously, when we take a look at AMD's 8840U, again, remember, When we take a look at 5-watt TDP on AMD, we're going to be using something that's closer to like 10-watt on Intel. So I'm going to look at this graph, look at it as you can see the 8840U is doing much better. However, if I adjust this graph and I adjust it for total system power, meaning I move Intel's power, the TDP, I give it +5 TDP for every watt, this is going to align it more so that it's even from a total system power perspective. And when we still look at this, AMD's 8840U is still much better than Meteor Lake across the board. And we're going to kind of see this a lot when we take a look at the benchmarks, which is going to be coming up in just a moment. So with that in mind, when you have this as a good frame of reference of how AMD scales against Intel's Meteor Lake from a GPU bounce perspective, this is what benchmarks look like on a few different games. Jumping straight into the benchmarks, up first, we're taking a look at Cyberpunk 2077. This is using 720p with no upscaling. So this is 720p native. FSR2 is disabled. Additionally, I'm using the SteamDeck preset for all of my graphical settings. I also double-checked all of these just to make sure that they were correct, and this is how it was. Now, again, the other part that we need to mention here is that when I do my tests, I always cap at different TDPs. So we have 10-watt TDP slice, a 15-watt TDP slice, 20-watt TDP, and 25-watt TDP. Additionally, earlier on in this video, it has been made clear to you guys that when I compare to other platforms, especially AMD's 8840U, if we set 10-watt TDP on AMD 8840U, my total system power is like 17 or 18-watt TDP. However, on Intel, if I set 15-watt TDP, my total system power is also 17 to 18-watt total system power. So when we compare AMD's 8840U to Intel's 155H, I have to swing the TDP back 5 watts on AMD side just to show a more fair comparison total system power-wise. So I'll do that for you. Basically, I'll be comparing AMD's 8840U 20-watt compared to Intel's 25-watt. And that will give us a closer relationship to what total system power is like when we compare both of those platforms. So up first, we'll take a look at the 10-watt TDP slice. And again, if we were earlier on in this video, the idle power consumption is very, very high on this device. So at 10-watt TDP, there isn't enough power for this system to do anything because it needs a bunch of power just to do nothing. So we have to bump it up to 15 watt just to get anything out of the system. And we're looking at 20.1 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 4.2 FPS. At 20 watt TDP, we're looking at 24.4 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 5.1 FPS. And at 25 watt TDP, we're looking at 30.5 FPS average. However, our 1 percentile is 9.5 FPS. This really isn't very good at all. And other people have mentioned, there's other reviewers that have mentioned Cyberpunk being pretty bad, and it's not great. If we compare this to AMD's 8840U at 20 watt TDP, this is what it's like. At AMD's 8840U at 20 watt is 50.7 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 38 FPS. And this is pretty playable at those particular settings, but on Intel, it's not good at all. Let's take a look at the next game. Okay, the next game we're going to be taking a look at is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. I'm using the DirectX 11 backend, and I'm using the Ultra preset. One of the reasons why I love running this game is it's one of the last DirectX 11 hard games that exists. There's another game, basically there's no resolution scaling, so this is like a late-gen DirectX 11 game with no resolution scaling whatsoever, and it would just really demand a lot from the system. And we're actually doing fairly decent on Intel's 155H here. So at 10 watt TDP, we're looking at 5.7 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 2.8 FPS. At 15 watt TDP, again, this is where the system starts waking up and actually doing work. We're looking at 21.2 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 11.4 FPS. And at 20 watt TDP, which is generally where I would recommend the lowest TDP you set for the device, we're looking at 27.1 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 18.8 FPS. And at 25 watt TDP, we're looking at 31 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 22.2 FPS. If I bring in the 8840U at 20 watt, this is what it looks like. So if I bring in the 8840U, again, the 20 watt TDP setting on the 8840U would be comparable in total system power wise to 25 watt TDP on Intel. So even though we're pushing 5 more watts into Intel total system power wise, they are comparable. So you're going to get around 30 watts or so, 31 watt, 31, 32 watts of total system power that you're going to be using. And when we take a look at the 8840U, specifically set at 7500 megatransfers, our FPS average is 47.6 and our 1 percentile is at 35.2. So once again, we're still pretty far behind, and it's looking like AMD, even when we're looking at it, comparing them total system power wise to make it more even, that AMD is still beating it by 50%. So that's it's a pretty sizable lead still from AMD. Okay, up next, we're going to be taking a look at Horizon Zero Dawn. This is running 720p, no upscaling, and I'm using the Favor Performance preset. When we take a look at this, our 10 watt TDP slicer, we're looking at 5.1 FPS average. Our 1 percentile is 1.4 FPS. At 15 watt TDP, again, this is when the system just basically starts waking up. We're looking at 16.4 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 7.9 FPS. At 20 watt TDP, we're looking at 27.5 FPS average, with our 1 percentile being 17.4 FPS. And at 25 watt TDP, we're looking at 36 FPS average, and our 1 percentile being 29 FPS. This is, at 25 watt TDP, this is looking something that you can generally run and it'll be pretty playable. So this is pretty decent overall compared to what we're seeing. But again, you should be setting our baseline at 20 watt TDP. At 25 watt TDP, you're looking to use around 30-ish FPS, 30-ish watts total. Again, that's if you take a look at my battery life info in the chapter link below, you have a better idea of how much total system power we'll be using and what type of battery life you can expect out of the MSI Claw. If we were to look at the 8840U at 20 watt to make it comparable to Intel's 25 watt, bringing in AMD's 8840U at 20 watts, so it compares to Intel's 25 watt total system power wise. We're looking at 91.2 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 64.2 FPS. If we compare the averages, it's 254%. It's twice, 2.5 times better than Intel's offering. Again, it's really bad. All right, so the next game we're going to be taking a look at is Red Dead Redemption 2. This is 720p with no upscaling used whatsoever, and the Favor Performance preset. And how you get that is there's like a slider, a pretty big slider. And what you want to do is you want to click on it and make sure you move it to the right a little bit before you move it all the way to the left. And when you do that, the left being that side, but when you do that, that pretty much lowers all the graphical settings as low as they possibly can go. At 10 watt, we're actually doing pretty decent here. And what's interesting about this is that Red Dead Redemption 2, even on Tiger Lake, was always better than AMD's Renoir. That was one game where we always saw a really consistent lead on Intel's side. So I almost would wager that there's a fair amount of optimizations on Intel's side, especially on the G platform where Red Dead Redemption 2 runs really well. At 10 watt TDP, we're looking at 12.4 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 3.7 FPS. At 15 watt TDP, we are looking at 41.5 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 29.1 FPS. At 20 watt TDP, we're looking at 43 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 33.5. And at 25 watt, we're looking at 51.6 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 41.5. Now, I never actually looked at this game on 8840U, but I do have a 7840U result, so I'll show you what that looks like at 20 watt. So 7840U running at 20 watt is still superior to 25 watt Intel. So we're looking at 40% increase over Intel, which isn't bad considering comparatively to all the other stuff that we showed. Okay, and the last game that we're going to be looking on our list is Returnal. Now, this is 720p. However, I am using upscaling. This is FSR2 balanced, so it is upscaling to 720p, which means it's a sub-resolution of 720p from FSR2 balanced. Additionally, I'm using the low preset. Returnal is an absolutely brutal GPU test. It's one of the best GPU tests I think that we have currently because it murdercates GPUs. So if we take a look at our 1 percentile and averages at 10 watt TDP, we're looking at 3.4 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 1.2 FPS. Again, to be expected at 10 watt TDP on Intel's Meteor Lake. At 15 watt TDP, we're looking at 21.5 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 7.1 FPS. At 20 watt TDP, we're looking at 28.4 FPS average, and our 1 percentile is 13.1 FPS. And at 25 watt TDP, we're looking at 35 FPS average, and the 1 percentile is looking like 20 FPS. Let's bring in the 8840U at 20 watt to see what it's like. And look at that. We actually have Intel's 155H actually performing better in, at least so far, at averages. When we look at 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile, it's not as good as AMD's 8840U, showing that AMD's 8840U will have a more consistent frame time here. But if we take a look at this, our averages is 35 to 34. And if we take a look at our 1 percentile is only 15% better on AMD's 8840U, and 0.2 percentile is 30% better. Obviously, it's going to feel less hitchy on AMD's 8840U, but when we compare Intel 155H 25 watt TDP to the 8840U 20 watt, they're pretty similar, and Returnal is a very GPU bound test. So we're actually able to see Intel's GPU actually do something here. So Intel's GPU part is beefier, and we're actually seeing it compete with AMD's last generation RDNA 3, because the 780M that was on the 7840U previously came again. They didn't go to RDNA 3.5 or RDNA 4. So Intel really needs to pull it together for the next iteration of chips, because AMD is going to bring out their better GPU for their integrated parts, so they really have to step it up here. So if you remember earlier on in this video where I said it was impossible to recommend the MSI Claw, if we take a look at idle total system power, we take a look at the game benchmarks, it should make a lot more sense why I said it's impossible to recommend the MSI Claw. Where it is right now, for how much it costs compared to its competitors, the Asus RG Ally went on sale to $600 when the MSI Claw came out. There's no world where I could possibly recommend the MSI Claw at all. It would have to be substantially cheaper for me to even bother recommending it. And even then, I probably still wouldn't recommend it, because there's going to be sometimes games that come out and you're just going to have Intel driver problems. So again, this is not something that is favorable at all. But maybe we can try to tweak the system to get more out of it. Remember in the BIOS that I disabled the E-cores. Well, let's take a look at Doom Eternal with all E-cores active and all P-cores active and see what type of performance we get. And then I'm going to show you what it looks like with the E-cores disabled. Okay, so here's Doom Eternal running, and this is the default configuration for the MSI Claw. And if we take a look, it's 25 to 26 watt on TDP. If we take a look at total system power, we're at 34 watt. We're at 32 watt right now. So we're taking around 31 to 32 watts of total system power. You can see I'm running 1280 by 720, and the current FPS right here is fluctuating at 75 FPS with this current power draw. So I'll go ahead and start playing. You can see I'm dipping down to like 60-ish when I go down here. 50, we're at basically like 60 FPS. Had a little bit of a brief dip there. So effectively like 60-ish FPS when I'm down here, and we're still using around 35 watt total system power right now. So that's what we got. Okay, so here we are looking at Doom Eternal with the P cores only active and all of the E cores are disabled. You can see that we're getting around 80 FPS right here. Let's see if we have any particular difference when we look down here. And no, it's pretty much the same. We're at 60 FPS, much like we were before. What about total system power wise? Looks like we are using considerably more power by disabling those E cores. We're now at 40 watts total system power. So overall, we're just using more power here and getting effectively the same type of performance that we were when the E cores were also active. So not any real benefit here. And here we are looking at it on the SteamDeck OLED. Now we're getting pretty similar results to what we were getting in this same scene from the Intel side. However, we're using around 9 watts less total system power, getting basically the same performance. So if I go ahead and jump down here and do the same thing, we are still getting about 10 FPS better because we were like fluctuating really around 60 FPS. There we go. We're at 60, similar performance, but using considerably less power than what is required on the Intel side for the MSI Claw, even though we're getting very similar results here. Again, all these are still 720p, same high settings. This is what we're looking at. So this is what it looks like on the SteamDeck OLED. Let's go ahead and see what it looks like on the Asus RG Ally. All right, so here we are on the Asus RG Ally, and I've set the TDP on this device to 18 watt, and we can see that our total system power right there is around 27.5 watt, so around 3 to 4 watt less than what we're spending on the MSI Claw. So we'll go ahead and get down here and see that we're still fluctuating around the 70 FPS mark, like how it is on the Steam Deck. With the Steam Deck OLED version, we're basically getting the exact same performance that we are on Meteor Lake. However, we're using 10 watts less of total system power. And with the Steam Deck OLED with its 50 watt-hour battery, we're going to get even better battery life while still having the same performance that Meteor Lake is showing. So again, why would we go for Meteor Lake when the Steam Deck OLED, which is cheaper than Meteor Lake and the MSI Claw, at what point do you recommend this? And then if we take a look at the Asus ROG Ally, I set that to 20 watt TDP, which will give us around 27 and 28 watt total system power. Again, we're using around 3 to 4 less total system power, and yet I'm producing the same type of performance that's on Meteor Lake. Again, just like we saw in the benchmarks, it really makes no sense. Meteor Lake can compete with where AMD's last generation GPUs are. This is where Intel is at its best, and it's still not even good enough. AMD is going to be coming out with a better iGPU soon, so Intel really better go back to the drawing board, and if they want to enter into the handheld market, they're really going to have to make a chip that is optimally designed for a handheld so that we get excellent low TDP performance and we can scale that up just like we can on AMD. And that's what Intel needs to bring, because they better bring the heat, because AMD is coming. Let's go ahead and just start taking a look at the MSI side of this stuff. We're going to take a look first at MSI Center. I'm going to briefly talk about some of the software side of things on the MSI Claw. The bottom left button over here brings up their front end, which they call MSI Center M, and the bottom right button over here, this brings up the quick access menu. This is pretty much inverted from what the Asus ROG Ally does, with the bottom left being the quick access menu, and this is where you're going to get to a bunch of different controls that you can get to. You can add extra features and functionality in the quick access menu via the MSI Center M, and we'll get to that in just a moment. This is the main screen, and when you look up, you'll start seeing other different launchers. Now, I didn't have the Ubisoft launcher there. What's nice is it doesn't jump you to a web page to start downloading it. It actually fetches it from MSI Center itself and will auto install it. So it kind of opens up in the background. It may take a little bit, but basically what it's doing is it's launching the Ubisoft launcher right now, and there it is. And I didn't log into it, so I'll just go ahead and close out of this. We'll go back into MSI Center, and if we continue to look, you can see Xbox. We can bring that up, and that'll bring up the Xbox launcher. All good and great. Along the top, the one that's interesting to me is this one that says MSI app. This brings us to what is effectively a front end for Google Apps' own Android stuff, I think. I don't think that this is using an Android emulator. What's weird is all of this stops being controlled by the gamepad, and considering that it's the MSI app, it's weird that I'm now using a mouse like emulation mode to kind of navigate through this. So it's a bit odd and kind of have to just use the touchscreen to navigate around. But if you were to look at other types of Android apps that you can install on the PC side of things, you can play Android games on here if you wanted through this layer. Going back to the MSI Center, if we take a look, you can see the game library. And this will give you a full game library list. So this is the front end of what you're doing. If you press the button here, it would go ahead and launch it from whatever launcher it had on your system. So those games are installed on Steam for me, and it would start up with Steam. Down here, we see the little tack icon, which is user scenario. This is basically setting TDP. You can also get to this via the quick access menu. So if we go here, you can see it's set to balanced. Later on in this particular video, we're going to get into why setting the device between 20 and 30 watt really doesn't matter. Going lower than that isn't very helpful at all. So having the option to manually control TDP isn't a gigantic savings here. It's nice that they include it. One of the nice things about the MSI Claw, or specifically the Intel Core Ultra 7 155H, is that when we specify the TDP, there isn't a giant allowance over that for total system power. So it's a little bit better and more understood, especially for people when they set the power, that you're going to get somewhat close to what that is. Then we go into control mode. This one's a little bit interesting. So in control mode, you can go ahead and do key mapping, so you can change any of these to be whatever you want. Pretty understood. This also applies to stick layout, trigger layout, vibration, macro functions, or combination keys that you can do for these back buttons here. So all that stuff is pretty straightforward. On desktop, this is something that I wish was a little bit better, but I have not been able to find any way to redefine any of these keys whatsoever. So hopefully in a new software update, we can change that, because I'm not a big fan of right mouse button being B. That is probably just me, but I like using the top triggers for mousing. How it is right now, not the biggest fan, but you can change stick and combination buttons and have macro keys for the desktop mode. Again, you can change this if you go into the quick access menu, and you can change this real quick if you go desktop. You need to go gamepad right there. You can do desktop, or you can do, it should have had auto, but it doesn't show that, which is fine. So we're in desktop mode. Back out of that, and we'll go to quick settings editor. This is the editor part of things where you can add features and functionality or remove it from the quick access menu. This is really nice, and some of the other stuff that you're going to want to do there. In Bluetooth, it's pretty straightforward, turning Bluetooth on or off. Same for Wi-Fi, turning Wi-Fi on or off. And then lastly is settings. Now this is where you're going to be able to disable or change some of the other stuff. So if we take a look at the AI engine, this AI engine is ostensibly something that is going to learn based on what you're doing and try to configure the system to use as little power as possible, or just the correct amount of power as possible. But in practice, I didn't really feel like it was doing anything at all. This Mystic Light, this is to change the LED lighting. This also applies to the lighting of the buttons themselves, which is nice to see. It's pretty cool to see. In this, the Nahimic, I have no idea how we're supposed to pronounce this. This is to the optimized audio experience. For what it's worth, the speakers that are on this device are excellent, like truly great. As other people have mentioned, specifically Cypher as well, it does almost act like a secondary rumble. Like the bass on it offers a specific type of rumble that is, I don't know, I actually liked it. So it's pretty good, all things considered. You can also do noise cancellation for speaker or microphone. I disable this stuff because I don't want this stuff running in the background, doing extra stuff, potentially making performance worse. So I just went ahead and disabled that for all of my tests. The media gallery, this is where you can take a look at that screenshots of stuff that you've taken. System info, this one's pretty straightforward. It's what it has. The live info, the live update, this is where you're going to go to update everything on the MSI Claw itself. This is a service tab. This is going to be registering and everything. And then there's general settings here as well. And that pretty much covers everything on the MSI Center, as well as the quick access menu, as a brief trip to what's available to us on the MSI Claw. So that's MSI Center. For all intents and purposes, it's pretty straightforward. It's a little bit half-baked. We're actually going to touch base in my build quality review how some things in MSI Center don't actually do anything just yet. So like for the analog sticks, I'm trying to set the sensitivity of the outer range on it, and it does absolutely nothing. So let's get into the build quality review of the MSI Claw. All right, now we're going to get into the build quality part of looking at the MSI Claw. We're going to finish off on the front end of this device last. Let's just take a look at what's going along here. Now, the one thing that it feels fine in hand, like when you're holding it, the ergonomics are fine and everything, but the design, the aesthetics of the device are very much gamer, like the traditional like PC gamer. And I don't know who started it, but it's all with these like outrageous edges for no reason whatsoever. How this feels in hand is fine. It's more than fine enough. The triggers are pretty shallow in terms of how much range they have. It's not a bad thing. It's just a preference. I would have liked to have a little bit more travel. Tension-wise, they're very good. Here we have our digital volume buttons to increase or decrease volume, our 3.5mm audio jack, the engraved MSI True Gaming that is in there. Like, it's necessary, I guess, to have that. Here we have a Thunderbolt 4 port, so you can actually connect this to a Thunderbolt eGPU. Here is the microSD card slot, and it's actually very similar looking to how the Asus RG Ally looks, which, for what it's worth, I did a lot of testing via the microSD card. All the games that I tested were that, just to see if I could have anything break. Good news is that I have had no problems with using this SD card at length for a few days that I've had this. This is the power button that doubles as the fingerprint sensor as well. Then on the back of this device, we have this really extreme design that is just a bit over the top for me and not something that I particularly care for. We'll finish it off with the very gamery type of setting. It's a bit thicker than the Asus RG Ally, and it should be because we have a 55 watt-hour battery, so it's also a bit heavier than the Asus RG Ally, but I approve of having the bigger battery. Now, on to the front buttons and the controls. There's a few things that I'm not really a fan of. Even though we have these hull-based analog sticks and the fidelity and finesse of them is good, the few things that I would talk about. Number one is the inner dimple for here. I wish that had a bit more of a concavity to it. It's pretty flat. Okay, it's mostly flat. It has a very shallow concavity to it. I wish the concavity was just a little bit deeper. Also, the ridging that they have around the side of the analog stick doesn't really do much. As I'm holding it, there is no extra grip that I gain from having this dimpled surrounding around the analog stick. The other part that I wish was a bit better is, even though these are hole-based analog sticks, they offer almost zero tension. So the tension is very, very loose. I've used better analog sticks. Having said that, they're fine for what they are. Now, the next part that we have to bring up is that by default, they want to be they want to do this full circle stuff, and full circle really doesn't matter. But look at what's a problem with my left analog stick. When I move, you can see right there that there's a divot, and I have to kind of go back and forth to like get to the bottom. So if I were to test circularity and go like this, you can see that I actually have that little quadrant there that doesn't actually make the circle. So I have to like go back and forth to get that. So this isn't great. And what should be happening here is I should be able to go to the control mode and go to gamepad mode and go to sticks and change it. They're both at 100, so that's as best as I can do it, but it doesn't look like any of this is actually working. If I make that 70%, it should go in, but like it doesn't do anything. It's not changing anything. So I think that the MSI Center is not fully baked, because this doesn't appear to do squat, so who knows what's going on here. This is something that MSI will have to figure out later. Again, this is only a few days after the device launch, so there's a lot of things that they're going to have to fix here. I would prefer if the software allowed us to go outside of the edges, so that people like me who want to do more than greater than this circularity have that ability. But for people that want this perfect circle, is what it is, and that's what it is by default. So I know a lot of people like that. It's not for me. I wish to have it go a little bit further along the outer edges, and that's just something that I prefer. On the face buttons, I've heard some people say they don't like the face buttons. I like them. I think the depression, how you use them, the tactility, I have no particular problem with them whatsoever. Face buttons are, they're not really bad. I've never really had a bad face button unless it was like super mushy. And these are responsive. They feel good to roll around. The immediacy of them, the feedback that you get, that you pressed it, both tactility-wise, feeling it wise, as well as an audible click. There is no discerning like, oh, did I press a button or not? So the face buttons are pretty good. When we take a look at the D-pad, if I could define ways that they could improve on it, is that when moving around there, it requires a good enough amount of pressure to push in any particular given direction. So there is a bit of fatigue that I could feel building up my thumb when I wanted to press in any given direction. Also, trying to feather any particular diagonals required force. But I would say that there isn't any discerning if, like, when I go into the diagonal, it does do the diagonal. It just requires a bit more force than I would have preferred. But overall, it's fine. So I'd say it's more towards a B- in terms of the D-pad. And then we have the bumpers on the top, which are fine. And then the triggers, which don't have that much travel, but overall have really good tension. I would say very well-tuned tension, and that is good as well. And that's taking a look at the build quality of the MSI Claw. The last parts that I want to take a look at in the build quality part of this review is taking a look at the standby modes that are available to us. So we don't have S3, we only have standby, S0, which is modern standby. We have hibernate and fast startup. I would personally recommend disabling fast startup. I never found really much of a use for it. Taking a look at CRU, we can see that the panel is 48 to 120 hertz on VRR, so it's a 1080p 120 hertz VRR display, and it goes down to 48 hertz, very, very similar to what the Asus RG Ally has. The other thing that I wanted to note is that even when you push this machine really hard, going to like 35 watt or 40 watt, the fans stay very, very low. MSI seems like they don't mind if the chip gets boilingly hot, and they don't really care about thermal throttling all that much. It will keep those fans spinning very low and mostly inaudible. And that's pretty much the last of the build quality part of this review. So that's it for my review on the MSI Claw. It's quite literally impossible to recommend. It needs a lot of work from MSI just to fix all the software end of things. Intel has a tremendous amount of work to fix on driver side of things. But even after they fix the driver side, I'm not even sure that we're going to be able to extract enough performance out of it to make it recommendable. As it is right now, I can't find this to be worthwhile to keep it all, and I'm probably just going to see if I can return it. That's where I am with the MSI Claw. Thank you very much to my Patreon members. Thank you very much to my YouTube channel members. Your guys' support means the world to me. Really do appreciate it. Thank you very much to my subscribers. I hope this was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.